mind, the bright morning, treacherously bright, he thought, had not banished the fear of pursuit, and he pondered the words of Gilder. The merry voice of Pippin came to him. He was running on the green turf and singing. He said to him, and was watching. For Frodo's mind, the bright morning, treacherously bright, he thought, had not banished the fear of pursuit, and he pondered the words of Gilder. The merry voice of Pippin came to him. He was running on the green turf and singing. No, I couldn't, he said to himself. It's one thing to take my young friends walking over the Shire with me until we're hungry and weary and food and bed are sweet. Take them into exile, where hunger and weariness may have no cure, it's quite another thing, even if they were willing to come. The inheritance is mine alone. I don't think I ought even to take Sam. He looked at Sam Gamgee and discovered that Sam was watching him. Well, Sam, he said, what about it? I'm leaving the Shire as soon as ever I can. In fact, I've made up my mind now not even to wait a day at Crick Hollow if it can be helped. Very good, sir. You still mean to come with me? I do. It's going to be very dangerous, Sam. It's already dangerous. Most likely neither of us will come back. If you don't come back, sir, then I shan't, that's certain, said Sam. Don't you leave him, they said to me. Leave him, I said. I never mean to. I'm going with him if he climbs to the moon. And if any of those black riders try to stop him, they'll have Sam Gamgee to reckon with, I said. They laughed. Who are they? What are you talking about? Why, the elves, sir. We had some talk last night. They seemed to know you were going away, so I didn't see the use of denying it. Wonderful folk, elves, sir. Wonderful. They are, said Frodo. Do you like them still, now that you've had a closer view? Well, they seem a bit above my likes and dislikes, so to speak, answered Sam, slowly. It don't seem to matter what I think about them. They are quite different from what I expected. They're so old and young, and so gay and sad, as it were. Frodo looked at Sam, rather startled, half expecting to see some outward sign of the odd change that seemed to have come over him. It didn't sound like the old voice of the old Sam Gamgee that he thought he knew, but it looked like the old Sam Gamgee sitting there, except that his face was unusually thoughtful. Do you feel any need to leave the Shire now that your wish to see them has already come true? He asked. Well, yes, sir. I don't know how to say it, but after last night, I feel different. I seem to see ahead in a kind of a way. I know we're going to take a very long road into darkness, but I know I can't turn back. It isn't to see elves now, nor dragons, nor mountains that I want. I don't rightly know what I want, but I have something to do before the end. And it lies ahead, not in the Shire. And I must see it through, sir, if you understand me. I don't altogether, but I understand that Gandalf chose me a good companion. I'm content. We will go together. Frodo finished his breakfast in silence, and then standing up he looked over the land ahead and called to Pippin. "All ready to start?" he said as Pippin ran up. "We must be getting off at once. We slept late, and there's still a good many miles to go." "You slept late, you mean," said Pippin. "I was up long before. We were only waiting for you to finish eating and thinking. Well, I've finished both now. I'm going to make for Buckleberry Ferry as quickly as possible, and I am not going out of the way, back to the road where we left last night. I'm going to cut straight across country from here." "Ha, ha, ha, then you're going to fly," said Pippin. "You won't cut straight on foot anywhere in this country." "We can cut straighter than the road anyway," answered Frodo. "The ferry is southwest from Woodhall, but the road curves around to the left. You can see a bend of it away north over there. It goes around the north end of the marsh so as to strike the highway, the causeway, from the bridge above Stock, but that's miles out of the way. We could save a quarter of the distance if we made a line for the ferry from where we stand." "Short cuts make long delays," argued Pippin. "The country's rough around here. There are bogs, all kinds of difficulties down in the Marish. I know the land in these parts, and if you're worrying about black riders, I can't see that it's any worse meeting them on a road than on a wood or a field." "It is less easy to find people in the woods and fields," answered Frodo, "and if you're supposed to be on the road, then there is some chance that you will be looked for on the road and not off it." "All right," said Pippin. "I will follow you into every bog and ditch. But it is hard. I'd counted on passing the Golden Perch at Stock before sundown. It's the best beer in the East Farthing, or it used to be. It's a long time since I tasted it." "That settles it," said Frodo. "Shortcuts make delays, but inns make longer ones. And at all costs, we must keep you away from the Golden Perch. We want to get to Buckleberry before dark. What do you say, Sam?" "I'll go along with you, Mr. Frodo," said Sam, in spite of private misgivings and a deep regret for the best beer in the East Farthing. "Well, then, if we're going to toil through bog and briar, let's go now," said Pippin. It was already nearly as hot as it had been the day before, but clouds were beginning to come up from the west. It looked likely to turn to rain. The hobbits scrambled down a steep green bank and plunged into the thick trees below it. Their course had been chosen to leave Woodhall on their left and to cut slanting through the woods that clustered along the eastern side of the hill until they reached the flats beyond. Then they could make straight for the ferry over country that was open except for a few ditches and fences. Frodo reckoned they had 18 miles to go in a straight line. He soon found the thickets were closer and more tangled than it appeared. There were no paths in the undergrowth. They didn't get on very fast. When they had struggled to the bottom of the bank, they found a stream running down from the hills behind a deeply dug bed with steep, slippery sides overhung with brambles. And most inconveniently, it cut right across the line they'd chosen. They couldn't jump over it, or indeed get across it at all without getting wet and scratched and muddy. They halted, wondering what to do. "First check," said Pippin, smiling grimly. Sam Gamgee looked back. Through an opening in the trees he caught a glimpse of the top of the green bank from which they had just climbed down. "Look," he said, clutching Frodo by the arm. They all looked, and on the edge, high above them, they saw against the sky a horse standing, and beside it stooped a black figure. They gave up at once any idea of going back. Frodo led the way and plunged quickly into the thick bushes beside the stream. "Whew," he said to Pippin. "We were both right. The shortcut's gone crooked already, but we got under cover only just in time. You've got sharp ears, Sam. Can you hear anything coming?" They stood still, almost holding their breath as they listened. There was no sound of pursuit. don't fancy he'd try bringing his horse down that bank," said Sam. "But I guess he knows we came down it. We'd better be going on." Going on wasn't altogether easy. They had packs to carry, and the bushes and the brambles were reluctant to let them through. They were cut off from the wind by the hill behind them, and the air was still and stuffy. When they forced their way at last into more open ground, they were hot and tired and very scratched, and they were also no longer sure of the direction in which they were going. The banks of the stream sank as it reached the levels and became broader and shallower, wandering off toward the Marish and the river. The Marish is a sort of a swamp. "Why, this is the old Stock Brook," said Pippin. "If we're going to try to get back onto our course, we have to cross at once and go to the right." They waded the stream. They hurried over a wide open space, rush-grown and treeless, on the further side of it. Beyond that, they came again to a belt of trees, tall oaks for the most part, with here and there an elm tree or an ash. The ground was fairly level, and there was little undergrowth, but the trees were too close for them to see very far ahead. The leaves blew upward in sudden gusts of wind, and spots of rain began to fall from the overcast sky. Then the wind died away, and the rain came streaming down. They trudged along as fast as they could, over patches of grass, through thick drifts of old leaves, and all about them the rain pattered and trickled. They didn't talk. They kept glancing back and from side to side. After half an hour, Pippin said, "I hope we haven't turned too much toward the south. We're not walking longwise through this wood. It's not a very broad belt. I should have said no more than a mile at the widest. We should have been through it by now." "It's no use to start our going in zigzags," said Frodo. "That wouldn't mend matters. Let's just keep on going as we are going. I'm not sure I want to come out into the open yet." They went on for perhaps another couple of miles, and then the sun gleamed out of ragged clouds again, and the rain lessened. It was now past midday, and they felt it was high time for lunch. They halted under an elm tree. Its leaves were fast turning yellow, but they were still thick, and the ground at its feet was fairly dry and sheltered. When they came to make their meal, they found the elves had filled their bottles with a clear drink, pale golden in color. It had the scent of honey made of many flowers, and it was wonderfully refreshing. Very soon they were laughing, snapping their fingers at rain and at black riders. The last few miles, they felt, would soon be behind them. Frodo propped his back against the tree trunk and closed his eyes. Sam and Pippin sat near, and they began to hum and then to sing softly. "Ho, ho, ho, to the bottle I go, to heal my heart and drown my woe. Rain may fall and wind may blow, and many miles be still to go, but under a tall tree I will lie, and let the clouds go sailing by." "Ho, ho, ho," they began again. They stopped short suddenly. Frodo sprang to his feet. A long-drawn wail came down the wind, like the cry of some evil and lonely creature. It rose and it fell, and it ended on a high, piercing note. Even as they sat and stood as if suddenly frozen, it was answered by another cry, fainter and further off, but no less chilling to the blood. There was then a silence, broken only by the sound of the wind and the leaves. "What do you think that was?" said Pippin, at last, trying to speak lightly, but quavering a little. "If it was a bird, it was one I never heard in the Shire before." "It wasn't a bird or a beast," said Frodo. "It was a call or a signal. There were words in that cry, though I couldn't catch them, but no hobbit has such a voice." No more was said about it. They were all thinking of the riders, but no one spoke of them. They were now reluctant either to stay or to go on, but sooner or later they had to get across the open country to the ferry, and it was best to go sooner and in daylight. In a few moments they shouldered their packs again and were off. Before long the wood came to a sudden end. Wide grassland stretched before them. They saw now that they had, in fact, turned too much to the south. Away over the flats they could glimpse the low hill of Buckleberry across the river, but it was now to their left. Creeping cautiously out from the edge of the trees, they set off across the open as quickly as they could. At first they felt afraid, away from the shelter of the wood. Far behind them stood the high place where they had breakfasted. Frodo half expected to see the small, distant figure of a horseman on the ridge, dark against the sky, but there was no sign of one. The sun, escaping from the breaking clouds as it sank toward the hills they had left, was now shining brightly again. Their fear left them, though they still felt uneasy. But the land became steadily more tame and well-ordered. Soon they came to well-tended fields and meadows. There were hedges, gates, and dikes for drainage. Everything seemed quiet and peaceful, just an ordinary corner of the Shire. Their spirits rose with every step. The line of the river grew nearer, and the black riders began to seem like phantoms of the woods now left far behind. They passed along the edge of a huge turnip field and came to a stout gate. Beyond it, a rutted lane ran between low, well-laid hedges toward a distant clump of trees. Pippin stopped. "I know these fields and this gate," he said. "We're on old Farmer Maggot's land. That must be his farm away there in the trees." "One trouble after another," said Frodo, looking nearly as much alarmed as if Pippin had declared that the lane was the slot leading to a dragon's den. The others looked at him in surprise. "What's wrong with old Maggot?" asked Pippin. "He's a good friend to all the Brandybucks. Of course he's a terror to trespassers. He keeps ferocious dogs, but after all, folk down here near the border, they have to be more on their guard." "I know," said Frodo, "but all the same," he added with a shamefaced laugh, I'm terrified of him and his dogs. I've avoided his farm for years and years. He caught me several times trespassing after mushrooms when I was a youngster at Brandy Hall. On the last occasion he beat me, and then he took me and he showed me to his dogs. 'See, lads,' he said, 'next time this young varmint sets foot on my land, you can eat him. Now see him off.' They chased me all the way to the ferry. I never got over the fright, though I dare say the beasts knew their business and wouldn't really have touched me." Pippin laughed. "Well, it's time you made it up, especially if you're coming back to live in Buckland. Old Maggot is really a stout fellow, if you leave his mushrooms alone. Let's get into the lane. We won't be trespassing. If we meet him, I'll do the talking. He's a friend of Mary's, and I used to come here with him a good deal at one time." They went along the lane until they saw the thatched roofs of a large house and farm buildings peeping out from among the trees ahead. The Maggots and the Puddyfoots of stock, and most of the inhabitants of the Marish country, were house dwellers, and his farm was stoutly built of brick and had a high wall all around it. There was a wide wooden gate opening out of the wall into the lane. Suddenly, as they drew near, a terrific baying and barking broke out, and a loud voice was heard shouting, "Grip! Bang! Wolf! Come on, lads!" Frodo and Sam stopped dead, but Pippin walked on a few paces. The gate opened, and 3 huge dogs came pelting out into the lane and dashed toward the travelers, barking fiercely. They took no notice of Pippin, but Sam shrank against the wall while 2 wolfish-looking dogs sniffed at him suspiciously and snarled if he moved. The largest, the most ferocious of the 3, halted in front of Frodo, bristling and growling. Through the gate there now appeared a broad, thick-set hobbit with a round, red face. "Hallo! Hallo! And who may you be? And what may you be wanting?" he asked. "Good afternoon, Mr. Maggot," said Pippin. The farmer looked at him closely. "Well, if it ain't Master Pippin, Mr. Peregrine Took, I should say," he said, changing from a scowl to a grin. "It's a long time since I saw you around here. It's lucky for you I know you. I was just going to set my dogs on any strangers. There are some funny things going on today. Of course, we do get queer folk wandering in these parts at times. Too near the river," he said, shaking his head. "But this fellow, he was the most outlandish I ever laid eyes on. He won't cross my land without a leave a second time, not if I can stop it." "What fellow do you mean?" said Pippin. "Then you haven't seen him?" said the farmer. "He went up the lane toward the causeway not a long while back. He was a funny customer and asking funny questions. But perhaps you'll come along inside and we'll pass the news more comfortable. Got a drop of good ale on tap if you and your friends are willing, Mr. Took." It seemed plain the farmer would tell them more if he was allowed to do it in his own time and fashion, so they all accepted the invitation. "What about the dogs?" said Frodo anxiously. The farmer laughed. "They won't harm you, not unless I tell them to. Here, Grip, Fang, heel," he cried. "Heel, Wolf." And to the relief of Frodo and Sam, the dogs walked away and let them go free. Pippin introduced the other two to the farmer. "Mr. Frodo Baggins," he said. "You may not remember him. He used to live at Brandy Hall." At the name, Baggins, the farmer started, and he gave Frodo a sharp glance. For a moment Frodo thought the memory of stolen mushrooms had been aroused, and that the dogs would be told to see him off. But Farmer Maggot took him by the arm. "Well, if that ain't queerer than ever," he said. "Mr. Baggins, is it? Come inside. We must have a talk." They went into the farmer's kitchen and sat by the open fireplace. Mrs. Maggot brought out beer in a huge jug and filled 4 large mugs. It was a good brew, and Pippin found himself more than compensated for missing the Golden Perch Inn. Sam sipped his beer suspiciously. He had a natural mistrust of the inhabitants of other parts of the Shire, and also he wasn't disposed to be quick friends with anyone who had beaten his master, however long ago. After a few remarks about the weather and the agricultural prospects, which were no worse than usual, Farmer Maggot put down his mug and looked at them all in turn. "Now, Mr. Peregrine," he said, "where might you be coming from, and where might you be going to? Were you coming to visit me? For if so, you'd gone past my gate without my seeing you." "Well, no," said Pippin, "to tell you the truth, since you've guessed it. We got into the lane from the other end. We'd come over your fields. That was quite by accident. We'd lost our way in the woods back near Wood Hall, trying to take a shortcut to the ferry." "If you were in a hurry, the road would have served you better," said the farmer. "I wasn't worrying about that. You have leave to walk over my land, if you mind, Mr. Peregrine. And you, Mr. Baggins, although I dare say you still like mushrooms." "Ah, yes, I recognize the name. I recollect the time when young Frodo Baggins was one of the worst rascals of Buckland. But it wasn't mushrooms I was thinking of. I had just heard the name Baggins before you turned up. Now, what do you think that funny customer asked me?" They waited anxiously for him to go on. "Well," the farmer continued, approaching his point with slow relish, "he came riding on a big black horse in at the gate, which happened to be open, and right up to my door. All black he was himself, too, cloaked and hooded up as if he didn't want to be known. Now, what in the Shire can he want, I thought to myself. We don't see many of the big folk over the border. And anyway, I'd never heard of any like this black fellow. 'Good day to you,' I says, going out to him. 'This lane don't lead anywhere. Wherever you might be going, your quickest way will be back on the road.' I didn't like the looks of him. And then when Grip came out, he took one sniff, and he let out a yelp as if he'd been stung. He put down his tail, and he bolted off howling. This black fellow sat quite still. "I come from yonder," he says, slow and stiff-like, pointing back west over my fields, if you please. "Have you seen Baggins?" he asked, in a queer voice, and he bent down towards me. I couldn't see any face, for his hood fell down so low. I felt a kind of a shiver down my back. I didn't see why he should come riding over my land so bold. "Be off," I says. "There are no Bagginses here. You're in the wrong part of the shire. You'd better go back west to Hobbiton. But you can go by the road this time." "Baggins has left," he answered in a whisper. "He is coming. He's not far away. I wish to find him. If he passes, will you tell me? I will come back with gold." "No, you won't," I says. "You'll go back where you belong double quick. I'll give you 1 minute before I call all my dogs." He gave a sort of a hiss. Well, it might have been laughing, but it might not. And then he spurred his great horse right at me, and I jumped out of the way only just in time. I called the dogs, but he swung off. He rode through the gate and up the lanes toward the causeway like a bolt of thunder. Now, what do you think of that? Frodo sat for a moment looking at the fire, for his only thought was how on earth would they reach the ferry. "I don't know what to think," he said. "And I'll tell you what to think," said Maggot. "You should never have gone mixing yourself up with Hobbiton folk, Mr. Frodo. Folk are queer up there." Sam stirred in his chair and looked at the farmer with an unfriendly eye. "But you always were a reckless lad. When I heard you'd left the Brandybucks and gone off with that old Mr. Bilbo, I said you were going to go find trouble. Mark my words, this all comes of those strange doings of Mr. Bilbo's. His money was got in some strange fashion in foreign parts, they say. Maybe there's some that wants to know what's become of the gold and the jewels that he buried in the hill at Hobbiton, as I hear." Frodo said nothing. The shrewd guesses of the farmer were rather disconcerting. "Well, Mr. Frodo, I'm glad that you've had the sense to come back to Buckland. My advice is to stay here. Don't get mixed up with these outlandish folk. You have friends in these parts. If any of these black fellows come after you again, I'll deal with them. I'll say you're dead, or you've left the shire, or anything you like. That might be true enough, for like as not, it's old Mr. Bilbo they want news of." "Maybe you're right," said Frodo, avoiding the farmer's eye and staring at the fire. Maggot looked at him thoughtfully. "Well, I see you have ideas of your own. It's as plain as my nose that no accident brought you and that rider here on the same afternoon. Maybe my news is no great news to you after all. I'm not asking you to tell me anything you got a mind to keep to yourself, but I see you are in some kind of deep trouble. Perhaps you're thinking it won't be too easy to get to the ferry without being caught." "I was thinking so," said Frodo. "But we've got to try and get there, and it won't be done by sitting and thinking, so I'm afraid we must be going. Thank you very much for your kindness. I've been in terror of you and your dogs for over 30 years, Farmer Maggot, though you may laugh to hear it. It's a pity, for I've missed a good friend. Now I'm sorry to have to leave so soon, but I'll come back, perhaps one day, if I get a chance." "You'll be welcome when you come," said Maggot, "but now I've got a notion. Near sundown already. We're going to have our supper, for we mostly go to bed soon after the sun. If you and Mr. Peregrine and all could stay and have a bite with us, we'd be pleased." And so should we," said Frodo. "But we must be going at once, I'm afraid. Even now it'll be dark before we can reach the ferry." "Ah, but wait a minute. I was going to say, after a bit of supper, I'll get out a small wagon and I'll drive you all to the ferry. That'll save you a good step, and it might also save you some trouble of another sort." Frodo now accepted the invitation gratefully, to the relief of Pippin and Sam. The sun was already behind the western hills, and the light was failing. 2 of Maggot's sons and his 3 daughters came in, and a generous supper was laid on the large table. The kitchen was lit with candles, and the fire was mended. Mrs. Maggot bustled in and out. 1 or 2 other hobbits belonging to the farm came in, and in a short time 14 sat down to eat. There was beer in plenty, and a mighty dish of mushrooms and bacon, besides much other solid farmhouse food. The dogs lay by the fire and gnawed rinds and cracked bones. When they had finished, the farmer and his sons went out with a lantern and got the wagon ready. It was dark in the yard, and the guests came out. They threw their packs on the wagon and climbed in. The farmer sat in the driving seat and whipped up his two stout ponies. His wife stood in the light at the open door. "Now you be careful of yourself, Maggot," she called. "Don't you go arguing with any foreigners. You come straight back." "I will," he said, and he drove out the gate. There was now no breath of wind stirring. The night was still and quiet. A chill was in the air. They went without lights and took it slowly. After a mile or two, the lane came to an end, crossed a deep dike, and climbed a short slope up onto the high-banked highway. Maggot got down and took a good look in either direction, north and south, but nothing could be seen in the darkness, and there was not a sound in the still air. Thin strands of river mist were hanging above the dikes and crawling over the fields. "It's going to be thick," said Maggot, "but I'll not light my lanterns until I turn for home. We'll hear anything on the road long before we meet it tonight." "Yes, I think we'll move on now," said Frodo, "but not on the road, in case that rider comes back or another follows him. We ought to do a good step more today. Buckland's still miles away." The shadows of the trees were long and thin on the grass as they started off again. They now kept a stone's throw to the left of the road, kept out of sight of it as much as they could. But this hindered them, for the grass was thick and tussocky, clumpy, and the ground was uneven, and the trees began to draw together into thickets. The sun had gone down red behind the hills at their backs, and evening was coming on before they came to the end of the long level over which the road ran straight. At that point it bent somewhat southward and began to wind again as it entered a wood of ancient oak trees. Not far from the edge of that road they came on the huge hulk of a tree. It was still alive. It had leaves on the small branches that it had put out around the broken stumps of its long fallen limbs, but it was hollow. It could be entered by a great crack on the side that was away from the road. The hobbits crept inside and sat there upon a floor of old leaves and decayed wood. They rested and had a light meal, talking quietly and listening from time to time. Twilight was about them as they crept back to the road. The west wind began sighing in the branches. Leaves were whispering. Soon the road began to fall gently down, but steadily into the dusk. A star came out above the trees in the darkening east before them. They went side by side and in step to keep up their spirits. After a time, as the stars grew thicker and brighter, the feeling of disquiet, uneasiness left them, and they no longer listened for the sound of hoofs. They began to hum softly, as hobbits have a way of doing as they walk along, especially when they're drawing near to home at night. With most hobbits, it's a supper song or a bed song. But these hobbits hummed a walking song, though not, of course, without any mention of supper and bed. Bilbo Baggins had made the words to a tune that was as old as the hills, and he had taught it to Frodo as they walked in the lanes of the water valley and talked about adventure. Upon the hearth the fire is red, beneath the roof there is a bed, but not yet weary are our feet, still round the corner we may meet a sudden tree, a standing stone, that none have seen but we alone. Tree and flower, leaf and grass, let them pass, let them pass, hill and water under sky, pass them by, pass them by. Still round the corner there may wait a new road or a secret gate. Though we pass them by today, tomorrow we may come this way and take the hidden paths that run toward the moon or to the sun. Apple, thorn, and nut and slow, let them go, let them go. sand and stone and pool and dell. Fare you well. Home is behind, the world ahead, and there are many paths to tread. Shadows to the edge of night, until the stars are all alight. A world behind and home ahead, we'll wander back to home and bed. Mist and twilight, cloud and shade, away shall fade, away shall fade. Fire and lamp and meat and bread, and then to bed, and then to bed. The song ended. And now to bed, and now to bed, sang Pippin in a high voice. Hush, said Frodo. I think I hear hoofs again. They stopped suddenly and stood as silent as tree shadows, listening. There was a sound of hoofs on the road, some way behind, but coming slow and clear down the wind. Quickly and quietly they slipped off the road, ran into the deeper shade under the oak trees. Don't let us go too far, said Frodo. I don't want to be seen, but I want to see if it's another black rider. Very well, said Pippin, but don't forget the sniffing. The hoofs drew nearer. They had no time to find any hiding place better than the general darkness under the trees. Sam and Pippin crouched behind a large tree bole, that's a tree trunk, while Frodo crept back a few yards toward the road. The road showed gray and pale, a line of fading light through the wood. Above the stars were thick in the dim sky, but there was no moon. The sound of hoofs stopped. As Frodo watched, he saw something dark pass across the lighter space between two trees and then halt. It looked like the black shade of a horse, led by a smaller black shadow. The black shadow stood close to the point where they had left the road, and it swayed from side to side. Frodo thought he heard the sound of snuffling. The shadow bent to the ground, and then it began to crawl toward him. Once more the desire to slip on the ring came over Frodo, but this time it was stronger than before, so strong that almost before he realized what he was doing, his hand was groping in his pocket. But at that moment there came a sound like mingled song and laughter. Clear voices rose and fell in the starlit air. The black shadow straightened up and retreated. It climbed onto the shadowy horse, and it seemed to vanish across the road into the darkness on the other side. Oh, Frodo breathed again. Elves, said Sam in a hoarse whisper. Elves, sir. He would have burst out of the trees and dashed off toward the voices if they hadn't pulled him back. Yes, it is elves, said Frodo. One can meet them sometimes in the woody end. They don't live in the Shire, but they wander into it in spring and autumn out of their own lands way beyond the Tower Hills, and I'm thankful they do. You didn't see, but that black rider stopped just here. He was actually crawling toward us when the song began. As soon as he heard the voices, he slipped away. What about the elves, sir? Said Sam, too excited to trouble about the rider. Can't we go and see them? Listen, they're coming this way, said Frodo. We only have to wait by the road. The singing drew nearer. One clear voice rose now above the others. It was singing in the fair elven tongue, of which Frodo knew only a little, and the others knew nothing. And yet the sound, blending with the melody, seemed to shape itself in their thought into words which they only partly understood. This was the song as Frodo heard it. Snow White, O Lady clear, O Queen beyond the western seas, O light to us that wander here, amid the world of woven trees. Gilthornial, O Elbereth, clear are thy eyes, and bright thy breath. Snow white, we sing to thee in a far land beyond the sea. The stars that in the sunlit year with shining hand thy hair was sewn, in windy fields now bright and clear, we see your silver blossom blown. O Elbereth, still so near, we still remember we who dwell in this far land beneath the trees, thy starlight on the western seas. The song ended. These are high elves. They spoke the name of Elbereth, said Frodo in amazement. I didn't know that any of that fairest folk were ever seen in the Shire. Not many now remain in Middle-earth east of the great sea. This is indeed a strange chance. The hobbits sat in shadow by their roadside. Before long the elves came down the road toward the valley. They passed slowly. The hobbits could see the starlight glimmering on their hair and in their eyes. They bore no lights, and yet they walked in a shimmer like the light of the moon above the rim of the hills before it rises, and it seemed to fall about their feet. They were now silent, and as the last elf passed, he turned and looked toward the hobbits and laughed. "Hail, Frodo!" he cried. "You're abroad late. Or are you perhaps lost?" And then he called aloud to the others, and all of the company stopped and gathered around. "This is indeed wonderful," they said. "3 hobbits in a wood at night. We haven't seen such a thing since Bilbo went away. What's the meaning of it?" "The meaning of it, fair people," said Frodo, "is simply that we seem to be going the same way as you are. I like walking under the stars, but I would welcome your company." "But we have no need of other company, and hobbits are so dull," they laughed. "And how do you know that we do go the same way as you, for you do not know whither we are going?" "And how do you know my name?" asked Frodo in return. "We know many things," they said. "We've seen you often before, with Bilbo, although you may not have seen us." "Who are you? Who is your lord?" asked Frodo. "I am Gildor," answered their leader, the elf who had first hailed him. "Gildor Inglorian of the house of Finrod. We are exiles. Most of our kindred have long ago departed, and we too are now only tarrying here for a while ere we return over the great sea. But some of our kinfolk dwell still in peace in Rivendell. Come now, Frodo, tell us, what are you doing? For we see that there is some shadow of fear upon you." "O wise people," interrupted Pippin eagerly, "tell us about the Black Riders." "Black Riders," they said in low voices. "Why do you ask about them?" "Because 2 Black Riders have overtaken us today. Or one has done so twice," said Pippin. "Only a little while ago he slipped away as you drew near." The elves didn't answer at once. They spoke together softly in their own tongue. At length Gildor turned to the hobbits. "We will not speak further of this here," he said. "We think you'd best come with us now. It's not our custom, but for this time we'll take you on our road, and you shall lodge with us tonight if you will." "Oh, fair folk, that is good fortune beyond my hope," said Pippin. Sam was speechless. "I thank you indeed, Gildor Inglorian," said Frodo, bowing. "Aelensilia luminum momentialmo. A star shines in the hour of our meeting," he added in the high elven speech. "Ho, ho, ho! Be careful, friends!" cried Gildor, laughing. "Speak no secrets. Here is a scholar in the ancient tongue. Bilbo is a good master. Hail, elf friend," he said, bowing to Frodo. "Come now with your friends and join our company. You had best walk in the middle so you don't stray. You may be weary before we halt." "Why, where are you going?" said Frodo. "For tonight we go to the woods on the hills above Woodhall. It's some miles, but you shall have rest at the end of it, and it will shorten your journey tomorrow." They now marched off again in silence, and they passed like shadows and faint lights, for elves, even more than hobbits, could walk when they wished without sound of footfall. Pippin soon began to feel sleepy, and he staggered once or twice, but each time a tall elf at his side put out his arm and saved him from a fall. Sam walked along at Frodo's side as if in a dream, with an expression on his face half of fear and half of astonished joy. The woods on either side became denser. The trees were now younger and thicker, and as the road went down lower, running down into a fold of the hills, there were many deep breaks of hazelwood on the rising slopes at either hand. At last the elves turned aside from the road. A green ride, that is a sort of an open grassy place, lay almost unseen through the thickets on the right, and this they followed as it wound back up the wooded slopes and on to the top of a shoulder of the hills that stood out into the lower land of the river valley. Suddenly they came out of the shadow of the trees, and before them lay a wide space of grass, gray under the night. On three sides the woods pressed down upon it, but eastward the ground fell steeply, and the tops of the dark trees growing at the bottom of this slope were below their feet. Beyond, the land lay dim and flat under the stars. Nearer at hand, a few lights twinkled in the village of Woodhall. The elves sat on the grass and spoke together in soft voices. They seemed to take no further notice of the hobbits. Frodo and his companions wrapped themselves in cloaks and blankets, and drowsiness stole over them. The night drew on, and the lights in the valley went out. Pippin fell asleep, pillowed on a green hillock. Away high in the east swung Ramirith, the netted stars. Those are the ones that we would call the Pleiades, the seven sisters. And slowly, above the mists, red Borgil rose, glowing like a jewel of fire. And that's the one that we would call Aldebaran, the eye of the bull Taurus. And then, by some shift of airs, all the mist was drawn away like a veil, and there leaned up as he climbed over the rim of the world, the swordsman of the sky, Menelvagar with his shining belt, and that's the constellation that we call Orion. The elves all burst into song. Suddenly, under the trees, a fire sprang up with a red light. "Come," the elves called to the hobbits, "come, now is the time for speech and merriment." Pippin sat up and rubbed his eyes. He shivered. "There's a fire in the hall and food for hungry guests," said an elf standing before him. At the south end of the greensward there was an opening. There the green floor ran on into the wood, and it formed a wide space like a hall, roofed over by the boughs of the trees. Their great trunks ran like pillars down each side of it. In the middle there was a wood fire blazing, and upon the tree pillars torches with lights of gold and silver were burning steadily. The elves sat around the fire upon the grass or upon the sawn rings of old trunks of the tree. Some went to and fro bearing cups and pouring drink. Others brought food on heaped plates and dishes. "This is poor fare," they said to the hobbits, "for we're lodging in the greenwood far from our halls. If ever you are our guests at home, we will treat you better." "It seems to me good enough for a birthday party," said Frodo. Pippin afterward recalled little of either food or drink, for his mind was filled with the light on the elf faces and the sound of their voices, so various and so beautiful that he felt like a waking dream. But he did remember that there was bread, surpassing the savor of a fair white loaf to one who is starving, and fruits, sweet as wild berries and richer than the tended fruits of gardens. And he drained a cup that was filled with a fragrant draught, cool as a clear fountain, golden as a summer afternoon. Sam could never describe in words or even picture clearly to himself what he felt or thought that night, although it remained in his memory as one of the chief events of his life. The nearest he ever got was to say, "Well, sir, if I could grow apples like that, I would call myself a gardener." But it was the singing that went to my heart, if you know what I mean. Frodo sat eating, drinking, talking with delight, but his mind was chiefly on the words spoken. He knew a little of the elf speech, and he listened eagerly. Now and again he spoke to those that served him and thanked them in their own language. They smiled at him and said, laughing, "Here is a jewel among hobbits." After a while Pippin fell fast asleep. He was lifted up and borne away to a bower under the trees, and there he was laid upon a soft bed and slept the rest of the night away. Sam refused to leave his master. When Pippin had gone, he came and sat curled up at Frodo's feet, where at last he nodded and closed his eyes. Frodo remained long awake, talking with Gildor. They spoke of many things, old and new, and Frodo questioned Gilder about much happenings in the wide world outside the Shire. The tidings were mostly sad and ominous of gathering darkness, the wars of men, and the flight of the elves. At last Frodo asked the question that was nearest to his heart. "Tell me, Gilder, have you ever seen Bilbo since he left us?" Gilder smiled. "Yes," he answered, "twice. He said farewell to us on this very spot, but I saw him once again, far from here." He would say no more about Bilbo, and Frodo fell silent. "You do not ask me or tell me much that concerns yourself, Frodo," said Gilder, "but I already know a little, and I can read more in your face than in the thought behind your questions. You're leaving the Shire, and yet you doubt that you will find what you seek, or accomplish what you intend, or that you will ever return. Is that not so?" "It is," said Frodo, "but I thought my going was a secret known only to Gandalf and my faithful Sam." He looked down at Sam, who was now snoring gently. "The secret will not reach the enemy from us," said Gildor. "The enemy?" said Frodo. "Then you know why I'm leaving the Shire?" "I do not know for what reason the enemy is pursuing you," answered Gilder, "but I perceive that he is. Strange indeed, though that seems to me. And I warn you, peril is now both before you and behind you, and upon either side." "You mean the riders?" said Frodo. "I feared they were servants of the enemy. What are the Black Riders?" "Has Gandalf told you nothing?" "Not about such creatures." Then I think it is not for me to say for more, lest terror should keep you from your journey. For it seems to me that you have only set out just in time, if indeed you are in time. You now must make haste. Neither stay nor turn back, for the Shire is no longer any protection to you." "I can't imagine what information could be more terrifying than your hints and warnings," exclaimed Frodo. "I knew danger lay ahead, of course, but I didn't expect to meet it in our own Shire. Can't a hobbit walk from the water to the river in peace?" "But it is not your own Shire," said Gildor. "Others dwelt here before hobbits were, and others will dwell here again when hobbits are no more. The wide world is all about you. You can fence yourselves in, but you cannot forever fence it out." "I know," said Frodo, "and yet it's always seemed so safe and familiar. What can I do now? My plan was to leave the Shire secretly and make my way to Rivendell, but now my steps are being dogged before I ever get to Buckland." I think you should still follow that plan, said Gilder. I do not think the road will prove too hard for your courage, but if you desire clearer counsel, you should ask Gandalf. I do not know the reason for your flight, and therefore I do not know by what means your pursuers will attack you. These things Gandalf must know. I suppose that you will see him before you leave the Shire. I hope so, but that's another thing that makes me anxious. I've been expecting Gandalf for many days. He was to have come to Hobbiton, at the latest 2 nights ago, but he never appeared. Now I'm wondering what can have happened. Should I wait for him? Gildor was silent for a moment. I do not like this news, he said at last. Gandalf should be late. Does not bode well. It is said, do not meddle in the affairs of wizards, for they are subtle and quick to anger. The choice is yours, to go or wait. And it is also said, answered Frodo, do not go to the elves for counsel, for they will say both no and yes. Is it indeed? Laughed Gilder. Elves seldom give unguarded advice, for advice is a dangerous gift, even from the wise to the wise, and all courses may run ill. But what would you? You've not told me all concerning yourself. How shall I then choose better than you? But if you demand advice, I will, for friendship's sake, give it. I think you should go now at once, without delay. And if Gandalf does not come before you set out, then I advise this. Do not go alone. Take such friends as are trusty and willing. Now, you should be grateful, for I do not give this counsel gladly. The elves have their own labors and their own sorrows, and they are little concerned with the ways of hobbits, or of any other creatures upon earth. Our paths seldom cross theirs, by chance or purpose. In this meeting, there may be more than chance, but the purpose is not clear to me, and I fear to say too much. I'm deeply grateful, said Frodo, but I wish you would tell me plainly what the Black Riders are. If I take your advice, I may not see Gandalf for a long while, and I ought to know what is the danger that pursues me. Is it not enough to know that they are servants of the enemy? Answered Gilder. Flee them. Speak no words to them. They are deadly. Ask no more of me. But my heart forebodes that ere all is ended, you, Frodo, son of Drogo, will know more about these fell things than Gildor and Glorian, and may Elbereth protect you. But where shall I find courage? Asked Frodo. That's what I chiefly need. Courage is found in unlikely places, said Gildor. Be of good hope. Sleep now. In the morning we shall have gone, but we will send our messages through the lands. The wandering company shall know of your journey, and those that have power for good shall be on the watch. I name you elf friend, and may the stars shine upon the end of your road. Seldom have we had such delight in strangers, and it is fair to hear words of the ancient speech from the lips of other wanderers in the world. Frodo felt sleep coming upon him, even as Gilder finished speaking. Oh, I will sleep now, he said, and the elf led him to a bower beside Pippin, and he threw himself upon a bed, and he fell at once into a dreamless slumber. A bower is when you cut branches, small branches of trees, and you sort of weave them to make yourself something like a little house or tent. Chapter 4. A Shortcut to Mushrooms. In the morning, Frodo woke refreshed. He was lying in a bower made by a living tree with branches laced and drooping to the ground. His bed was of fern and grass, deep and soft and strangely fragrant. The sun was shining through the fluttering leaves, which were still green upon the tree. He jumped up and went out. Sam was sitting on the grass near the edge of the wood. Pippin was standing studying the sky and weather. There was no sign of the elves. They've left us fruit and drink and bread, said Pippin. Come and have your breakfast. The bread tastes almost as good as it did last night. I didn't want to leave you any, but Sam insisted. Frodo sat down beside Sam and began to eat. What's the plan for today? Asked Pippin. To walk to Bucklebury as quick as possible, answered Frodo, and gave his attention to the food. You think we shall see anything of those riders? Asked Pippin cheerfully. Under the morning sun, the prospect of seeing a whole troop of them didn't seem very alarming to him. Yes, probably, said Frodo, not liking the reminder, but I hope to get across the river without their seeing us. Did you find out anything about them from Gilder? Not much, only hints and riddles, said Frodo evasively. Did you ask about the sniffing? We didn't discuss it, said Frodo with his mouth full. You should have. I'm sure it's very important. Well, in that case, I am sure Gilder would have refused to explain it, said Frodo sharply. Now leave me alone in peace for a bit. I don't want to answer a string of questions while I'm eating. I want to think. Oh, good heavens, said Pippin. At breakfast?